This is so depraved, so evil, that it is difficult to know where to even begin. A phrase that has often rightly been applied to the Israeli state goes like this: every accusation is a confession. And this story, which in fact emerged in the Israeli media, could not underline that more hideously. It's a story which first appeared in an Israeli investigative outlet called The Hottest Place in Hell, and is based on testimonies from Israeli soldiers themselves. That's in Hebrew, but the Israeli-Palestinian outlet Plus 972 magazine has helpfully written out in English what the report details. Let me just read the first sentence. A senior officer in the Israeli army's Nahal brigade tied an explosive cord around the neck of an 8-year-old Palestinian man and forced him to serve as a human shield, ordering him to scout out abandoned houses under threat of having his head blown off. After he had served his purpose, the soldiers ordered the man to flee with his wife, but upon being spotted by another battalion, they were both shot dead on the spot. This was last May in Zaytun, a neighbourhood in Gaza City, which is in the north, which has been subjected, of course, to the worst devastation in Gaza. The Israeli soldiers were conducting a sweep of houses there and then encountered an elderly Palestinian couple who told the soldiers, who could speak Arabic, that they could not evacuate because of their mobility issues. That compelled the man to use a cane. Their children had already fled. According to one of the Israeli soldiers quoted, at that stage, the commanders decided to use them as mosquitoes. Now, a mosquito is a euphemism for a human shield. The Israeli military forces Palestinian civilians to protect their soldiers from, say, being shot or blown up by explosives. The woman was then detained in her home, but the man, again, only able to walk with the help of his cane, was forced from house to house. As an Israeli soldier quoted as explaining puts it, he entered each house before us, so if there were any explosives or a militant inside, he would take the hit instead of us. This is already depraved behaviour, an intolerable war crime. But listen to this detail. Before the coerced sweep began, one of the officers took a detonation cord, that is an explosive fuse, which is used to connect charges and explosives, and then, according to Plus 972 magazine, attached it to an initiating charge and tied it around the elderly man's neck, so as this soldier put it, so he wouldn't run away even though he was walking with a cane. He was told that if he did anything wrong or didn't follow orders, the soldier behind him would pull the cord and his head would be torn from his body. This went on for 8 hours. The soldiers then brought this elderly man back to his home and then ordered both him and his wife to flee by foot to the so-called humanitarian zone of southern Gaza. Crucially, the soldiers did not inform the nearby soldiers that an elderly couple was about to cross through that area. According to the soldier, after 100 meters, the other battalion saw them and immediately shot them. They died like that in the street. Now, the Israeli investigative outlet, The Hottest Place in Hell, further relays testimonies from soldiers about the army's open fire regulations, which state that any Palestinian, whoever they are, found moving in a combat area after the designated evacuation time has passed is considered an enemy combatant. So this elderly couple were automatically considered enemy combatants by Israeli soldiers and killed. Plus 972 magazine state this is denied by the IDF, but they give that short shrift correctly. It is just worth for a minute pausing to reflect on something. A man who was at least 80 years old in Gaza was born in 1946 or 1945 or earlier. This man, as a small child, would have survived the Nakba, the violent expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes as Israel was founded, in which around 15,000 Palestinians were killed and 531 Palestinian towns and villages were wiped from the face of the earth. Statistically, he is likely to have been a child refugee whose family fled the Nakba, because the vast majority of Gaza's population are the families of those who fled then. He will have survived the 1967 war, when Israel seized Gaza and the West Bank. He will have survived decades of Israeli occupation. He survived the siege of Gaza, the longest siege of our age. He survived multiple brutal onslaughts on Gaza by Israel. He survived all of that. And his last moments on earth, this frail elderly man with poor mobility, his last moments on earth in the apocalyptic ruin of Gaza, were Israeli soldiers tying a detonation cord around his neck to force him to be a human shield, used to go from house to house to check for unexploded devices, each time not knowing if he was going to be blown up by such a device, with a threat of the Israeli soldiers blowing his head off with an explosive cord if he didn't comply. And after hours and hours and hours of that terror, that sheer terror, he was told to flee alongside his elderly wife, presumably who he'd been married to for so many decades and gone through so much together, knowing what his likely fate would be before they were gunned down after a few meters together. I resent having to play this sordid game, which is based on the total dehumanization of Palestinians, in which their lives are stripped of all meaning and all worth, but just imagine Hamas militants had done this to an elderly Israeli couple in their 80s. This atrocity alone would be deemed as conclusive evidence of Hamas's utter depravity, its evil. Indeed, it would be offered up as evidence of Hamas perpetrating the worst possible evil that humanity is capable of. But this is not said about the Israeli state and its armed forces. Instead, Western governments continue to arm a military committing these obscenities, and our media outlets overwhelmingly continue to cheerlead and whitewash what this military is doing. And this is surely the tip of the iceberg. We know that Israel has wiped Gaza from the face of the earth, and we know about multiple atrocities. But this is one atrocity from last May. And yes, it happens to have been brought to light this time. But how many such crimes are not being reported? Why would they be in the main? Israeli soldiers would have to come forward and discuss the crimes that they've committed. And no, you can't just say, oh, this is one-off. You know, maybe it's some rogue soldier. It was an entire unit. It was their commander who ordered this to happen. A group of soldiers and their commander did this together. Obviously, no one objected to any meaningful extent to stop this from happening. They all took part in it. It went on for hours. How many other such crimes are happening? And also, what does it tell us about the death toll? Who would have reported them dead? How are they reported dead to be included in the official statistics? By who? Which brings us back, by the way. This brings us back to every accusation is a confession. Last August, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz published an investigation headlined, Israeli army uses Palestinian civilians to inspect potentially booby-trapped tunnels in Gaza. The investigation stated, random Palestinians have been used by Israeli army units in the Gaza Strip for one purpose, to serve as human shields for soldiers during operations. It goes on, our lives are more important than their lives, soldiers were told. The thinking is that it's better for the Israeli soldiers to remain alive and for the Shwahashim, the names they used, to be the ones blown up by an explosive device. And that's the term Shwahashim used to describe these human shields. Other newspaper outlets, which are otherwise overwhelmingly biased towards Israel, have similarly reported on this crime. Last October, the New York Times published a report headlined, How Israel's army uses Palestinians as human shields in Gaza, with a subheading which gives you the gist. Israeli soldiers and Palestinian former detainees say troops have regularly forced captured Gazans to carry out life-threatening tasks, including inside Hamas tunnels. The same month, CNN also published a story headlined, The Israeli military has used Palestinians as human shields in Gaza, soldier and former detainees say. The next month, The Washington Post published, Israeli forces use civilians as human shields in Gaza, Palestinians and soldiers say. Before you give a cookie to these media outlets, yes, you always have had, I've said this from the beginning, you can find examples of good journalism about what Israel's atrocities are, what it's doing to the people of Gaza and beyond in these sorts of outlets. But they are orphaned, by which I mean they are not woven into the overall reporting of what's happened. They are outliers, which are not given proper prominence, and therefore, you know, the notion of Israel using human shields is not something which is then understood and processed with a consensus as an established fact. Instead, overwhelmingly, by contrast, the whole narrative in human shields is focused on claims that Hamas uses them. And this is a narrative used to justify wiping Gaza from the face of the earth and slaughtering civilians. On the grounds, all of this death and destruction is really caused because civilians are being placed in harm's way by Hamas. Now, strikingly, the definition of human shield here is completely different. There is a lot of goalpost moving here, I can assure you, because this is referring actually to military targets being in close proximity to civilian areas and to civilians. This is unhinged nonsense. Gaza is one of the most densely populated lands on earth, and if we're going to go there, Mossad and IDF headquarters are also located slap bang in the middle of civilian areas. Are Israeli civilians being used as human shields? For example, when Iranian missiles could potentially have blown one of those up. It is entirely right to hold Hamas to account for war crimes committed against Israeli civilians. The evidence for the use of human shields, however, simply isn't there. In the 2009 Israeli onslaught on Gaza, Human Rights Watch established the following. In the killings documented in this report, Human Rights Watch found no evidence that the civilian victims were used by Palestinian fighters as human shields or were shot in the crossfire between opposing forces. In each of the incidents, Israeli forces appeared in control and Palestinian fighters had left the area in question. The civilian victims were in plain view and posed no apparent security threat. In the 2014 Israeli onslaught on Gaza, Amnesty International, the other human rights organization who do so much work, obviously, in this area, they wrote, Amnesty does not have evidence at this point that Palestinian civilians have been intentionally used by Hamas, Palestinian armed groups during the current hostilities to shield specific locations or military personnel or equipment from Israeli attacks. In that same 2014 onslaught, the BBC's Jeremy Bowen wrote, I saw no evidence during my week in Gaza of Israel's accusation that Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields. Now, according to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, since the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began in 1967, Israeli forces have repeatedly used Palestinians as human shields, that is forcing them to perform military tasks that endanger their lives. The Israeli state has tried to justify genocide by using this whole trope of human shields, while at the same time using Palestinian civilians as human shields, including elderly, frail Palestinians who can barely walk, who are then shot alongside their elderly loved ones. Well, as I keep saying, for those who legitimized and cheered on Israel's genocide, no excuses, nowhere to hide. You cannot claim you did not know what the Israeli state was doing to the Palestinian people. No crime has been so confessed to by its perpetrators as it happened. No crime has been so evidenced by its victims as it happened. We owe it to that elderly Palestinian man and his elderly wife to fight to get them justice, just as we owe it to all Palestinians to get justice. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. That's all good for the algorithm, and then we need to get the message out about this sort of thing. And in that spirit, at patreon.com/OwenJones84, we're expanding our operations, including to TikTok, Instagram, X. You can see we're reaching much, much bigger audiences, which is the whole point. That's all thanks to you. You've all made that possible. Also, the podcast is now finally properly up and running. The backlog is being put up. You can, if you don't want to see my face, which I totally understand, you can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. From now on, that will be regularly updated. And that this time is an actual promise. So yes, you can do that. As you can see, we're expanding, making this, hopefully an operation which can ever more effectively challenge a broken media ecosystem in these truly dystopian times. So I'll speak to you soon.